All right, thank you. We're back with a really interesting panel here on Nordic design. My name is Charles Lorem. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director for Nordic Innovation House. We have some individuals here who represent different aspects of Nordic design and who could share their experience with us and talk about what is Nordic design, some of the trends that are happening, and then also what makes it relevant for folks here in the US. So I'd like to start out by first having each of our panelists introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do. So why don't you start us off here?
Hi, I'm Anna Sofia Martin. I'm the editorial director at Sparks and Honey, which is a cultural consultancy based here in New York City. I'm originally from Finland, been here 14 years, and what we do is we study different patterns in culture and how they affect different industries, and I'm the author of their intelligence reports, some of which touch on design aspects and generational ideation and things like that. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brendan Muha. I'm a partner at Red Associates. We are a management consulting firm started in Copenhagen about 15 years ago. Now we have offices in New York and most recently Paris. We're primarily social scientists, people with expertise in the humanities, similar to you, understanding cultural change and what that means for sort of product development, what that means for marketing, what that means for companies that are trying to be sort of relevant in changing cultural contexts.
Thank you. My name is Henrik Holm Petersen. I'm the vice president of Fritz Hansen, which is a Danish design furniture company. I've been in New York for the past 16 years, a couple of years in Asia before that, and actually a couple of years in the US prior to that as well. I've worked with a number of Danish design brands, so I think my take on this is going to be very much on kind of tangible things, in particular furniture.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate it. So I think the first question that is top of mind, especially even for those who are familiar a little bit with Nordic design here, is what is Nordic design? Especially what is Nordic design to you in a very personal sense also?
I can start. Nordic design is personal because I grew up with it, so it's something that you take for granted, really. I mean, it kind of means you're always within the vicinity of a tree in a certain way. And you don't even realize that Nordic design is what it is until you go somewhere else and you see things that you're not used to seeing. There's not everyone has the same type of furniture in other countries, so it's a sensibility, and it means that you're in touch with nature, and kind of it evokes a certain feeling and nostalgia, I think, for anyone who's grown up with it.
Yeah, all right. Well, I think I can second a lot of that. I grew up in Denmark, and I remember sitting on what we today consider a design chair at school. I'd go to the dentist office and I would sit at this happened to be a Fritz Hansen Grand Prix chair designed by Arne Jacobsen, and for me that's what you sit on because it's great and it's going to last forever, but didn't think much about it, so I agree. Not until I kind of left Denmark did I realize how people from outside look at it and realizing that there's a good reason we designed things the way we did. I think there's so much clutter in our lives, even more today than there was back then, right? We have impressions constantly from our phones and advertising and what have you. So I think Nordic design quite early on implemented some of these values about let's make things calm and less cluttered. Thinking sustainability before it even became a buzzword. Let's make things that actually last a lifetime instead of buying new, consuming all the time, right? Buy nice, not twice. So I think I didn't even think about it for many years, and now that I've been here for a lot, I start thinking about what are these Nordic design principles and why is it relevant to a lot of the world these days.
And you mentioned some of the values, and Brendan, maybe you could share your perspective on this. What are these values that inform design in the Nordics that are part of either the aesthetic or the construction or even just the way of doing business and the way that customers interact with the products?
I think, so I'm from New York, and I think I was quite pleasantly surprised and intrigued when I started working in Copenhagen, and I'm an architect by background, but sort of growing up in an American context and sort of influenced by that culture of design, for us, design is often about revolution. It's about kind of overthrowing the regime that came before. It's about positing a completely new vision of what the world should be like. And it's quite interesting to go to the Nordics and see a sort of continuity, see a kind of slow evolution of one generation kind of perfecting the design, slowly putting their mark on it, maintaining a kind of sensibility of economy of means, of sort of honesty, of sort of craft, all of that over time, but very subtly kind of evolving it to sort of keep up with the changing times. That's something that I appreciate. You can see, a very, sort of fashionable young person maybe has the same lamp in their living room as their parents or their grandparents, which you certainly wouldn't see in the US. I would never be caught dead with my grandparents' horrible old plastic, fake flowers and stuff.
Yeah, and we are in revolutionary times in a sense because of the pandemic we've all experienced and still lingers somewhat, and all the other changes that are going on. So what is happening now? All this change, the different types of influences that we're seeing on culture, on society, on the planet, on climate even. How are designers thinking about that?
When it comes to how our lives and spaces have really changed over the pandemic, I think if we look at even just at the home, and our experience of the home is completely and drastically changed. We need different things from it now. It's not just a space where you would leave in the morning, come back at night, and maybe enjoy a little on the weekend. It's a 24/7 space that has to serve all types of needs. So, and then the pandemic also changed the way we interact with the outside world. So we're constantly bringing the outside into our homes. So people became very conscious of the kind of aesthetic even that they're communicating through their Zoom calls and trying to create a private but functional space in the midst of, feeding your family and trying to do work calls or running your side business from your bedroom while your roommates are in the other room. So the shifts that people experienced are now bleeding into this different type of time that we're in, but we're going to carry on the experiences of the pandemic will change how we interact with the home still for a while.
I mean, one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the pandemic's effect is, we tend to see it a little bit less as a kind of full-on revolution and a little bit more as a sort of accelerator of some of the trends that we're already starting to see. I think one thing that was quite clear for us was that the home was really starting to become more a site of learning and more a site of sort of skill building. I think when you saw people, looking to improve their cooking skills, looking to develop new ways of working out, I think, for a long time, people focused on making stuff for the home. Maybe we're focused on sort of consumption or convenience or making things easy. We've seen, the home becoming a site of kind of learning and skill building, which I think, will continue past the pandemic.
And are you seeing some of those things from a customer perspective at your company, and how are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I think the changes that happened during the pandemic were probably bigger here in the US than they were in Scandinavia. I think for Denmark in particular, that's my background, right? I think most people already really enjoy putting money and effort into their homes. Your home is really important in Denmark in particular, right? Probably in Norway, Sweden, Finland as well. But from a Danish perspective, all of my friends have pretty nice homes. We invest in furniture. We buy to keep it and pass it on to the next generation. I don't think a lot changed there, but obviously we did see that a lot of people, instead of spending money on traveling, they put money into new furniture and what have you. I think there were more changes happening here in the U.S. and I wasn't in Denmark for the 2 years, kind of. In the height of the pandemic, but here we saw a lot of changes, and we did try to utilize that just from a business perspective. Let's try and get in and tell people about how your home can be better from all the things you mentioned. Right now that you're spending the entire day here and you both work and cook and live and sleep, let's do that. I think from a commercial perspective, like office spaces and so on, that's where we saw a bigger opportunity in that side, where I think we'll see a big opportunity going forward, kind of at the waves of the pandemic.
And I think too, when it comes to the home and younger generations, it became a personal brand. They might have done their outward-facing activities, whether it was for work or building whatever they're doing on TikTok outside before, but it became a space inside. And so they had to marry that sort of comfort and all the different aspects of what a home should be with the work outputs too. So thinking of what they're putting out from an aesthetic perspective too.
And so then, there just seems to be as a focus on maybe revolutionizing the workspace, and how do some of the values that we talked about earlier, the Nordic values that we talked about earlier, how does that influence how people are working now? And has there been this sort of revelation in the U.S. that maybe some sort of work-life balance is important, or maybe somehow the work environment, the space that we inhabit for 8 hours a day, does make a difference, and whether it's productivity or well-being, some of these other things?
I definitely think there's been a huge, I don't know whether this is working, but can you still hear me? I think there's been a huge change, and I don't think we don't just spend 8 hours at home anymore. Don't you switch? We spend 24 hours at home a lot of times now, because our home is now our workspace and it's our living space. That's where we are. So I think there's been a huge change in how we see this. I mean, a lot of people have now really done something to have a home office because they need to present themselves, and when they have meetings and what have you, right? So just from a furniture brand, we've seen people investing in that heavily alongside the rest of the home. I think a lot of people left the cities and moved closer to their hometown or to the mountains, or a lot of people started side businesses. Craftsmanship kind of became popular again. So in that sense, it had a huge change. And when we just kind of, from a business perspective, look, the residential market will probably start slowing down a bit, because we saw a huge peak in people investing in their homes during the pandemic. And I think the commercial market, so office space and hospitality and education, is now we're going to start seeing that, because companies will have to reinvent themselves somehow. You got to be able to draw people back to the office. You got to be able to actually draw new hires. And I think there's going to be a massive issue with, we have the big resignation happening right now. I think a lot of companies will actually find it hard to hire new people. I mean, one thing is that they resign, but actually hiring new people, it's going to be a lot of young people today who are like, why would we go and work 14 hours a day for this company in this rat race when we can now live in Montana and maybe make a lot less money, but still within our means and have a better life quality. And I think design, not necessarily furniture, but I think overall how we design society, and that's where I think Scandinavia has been good, is kind of with the human in the center of this, right? How do we make this society a great place to be a human? So I think a lot of things will happen in that sense, the broader design, if you will, coming out of the pandemic. I don't know if that really answered your question, but I was just riffing a bit.
Yeah, I think one thing we've seen is, and I see as an American sort of coming into a Nordic work context, something that I really liked about joining my company 9 or 10 years ago was the sort of flatness of the organization, the idea that people can all kind of sit in a room across different levels. You have access to the most senior people in the organization if you're the newest person, and you all kind of sit together and get work done. There's a lot of intimacy to that. You really get to know people on many different levels, and I think the pandemic was really tough for us and a lot of companies that have that kind of intimacy built into their business model, where all of a sudden people are on screens all day. It's, you can't have those kind of like warm moments of working together. You have to put something on somebody's calendar, it gets scheduled, it feels sort of rote. We were, I think, highly anomalous in New York. We reopened our office completely fully in September of last year, and had everyone come back, and it's been really actually quite lovely. People, I think, rightfully so, talk about how lovely it is to work in Montana, or to have all of this possibility in your private life that remote work enables. But at the same time, there is something about being part of a kind of work community that's in person and IRL and quite different from just dialing into meetings all day.
And I think when it comes to Nordic values and what's being represented since the pandemic, try this one. There we go. if we think of the values that Nordic design brings and how people have become more cognizant of them over the pandemic outside of the Nordics, because they represent things that were highlighted that people are really lacking. So space, time, closeness with nature, closeness with other people, sort of a coziness that people were missing. And then also the pandemic, I think for many people, highlighted vast inequalities, and the Nordics are sort of an emblem of equality in many respects. So from a design perspective, having the aesthetic kind of bring people forward in that way is something that is also comforting outside of the Nordics.
Yeah, some of the things that I heard was the human-centric design, the focus on collaboration and community, and then equality, and then how those intersect with design, and so there's this really strong recognition of that integration and that intersectionality. How have you seen this play out in a more concrete sense, either with design itself or the way that in the design space with either products or the visual aspects, or even thinking about like the construction and building of something? Are there some examples that you could share with us?
Can you just, the essence of the question is what?
So we're talking about the human-centric design and the integration with community. Can you think of some examples where you've seen that play out in a very concrete way, either in the design itself or in the final product?
I'll give it a go. So I think to me it's interesting, whenever you ask people what is a Danish design or Nordic design, I think most people think about furniture, right? It's kind of like that's the thing, right? And if you then think about, so what is Danish design when it comes to furniture, it's typically mid-century modern furniture, right? Inspired by the German Bauhaus and total design. And even to this date, I think if people were to point at a piece of Scandinavian furniture, it would be very likely by one of 3 or 4 famous Danish designers. And they designed these back in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. So it's interesting that that's still to a lot of people Danish design, and in reality it is. And I think, so to me, that the Danish or Scandinavian or Nordic design, a lot of it happened during that period, and that laid the foundation. And I think we were just coming out of Second World War, getting industrialized, if you will. I think a lot of Scandinavians kind of got back into nature. Obviously, some countries were hit harder by Second World War than others. But there was also not this pressure of capitalism that when we design or produce a product, it's because it fits into this category and we think it'll generate this much revenue. I think one of my favorite examples is Arne Jacobsen, a famous Danish architect who designed the SAS Royal Hotel in Copenhagen. He did the entire thing. It was total design, right? He did everything from the building to the cutlery to the curtains to the furniture, and none of it was kind of developed with capitalism in mind. It was because SAS now introduced traveling from Scandinavia to New York in only 25 hours, and that was really revolutionary, right? That you could do that. So he designed this thing around the experience with a human in the center. Long story short, Arne Jacobsen was Jewish, so he was one of many thousands of Jewish people who were transported from Copenhagen to Sweden in one night to avoid the Germans. And so he spent a number of years in Sweden really getting in touch with nature. And so when he came back, that was his main focus, was nature. So most of you, if you're into design, will know the egg chair, the swan chair, the drop chair. All of these were designed for this particular hotel project, and all inspired by nature because they had beautiful angles, they were comfortable, they would last a lifetime, and it wasn't trendy. It was designed with a real human and nature purpose. These are still our best sellers, and these are still what a lot of people would point to if you ask them what is a Danish design chair. It's that one. So I think it's this, again, human in the center of what we think. I hear all these companies talking about how human resources is the most important resource, yet many countries don't treat their people as the most important resource, and I think Scandinavia has got that right. We fixed that many years ago. Some of the issues we're dealing with today in this country, we sorted that out many years ago and agreed it's the human that is, in center, and everything kind of is around that, and that's why it works. And I think back then design was focused around that, not with we have to make this much money on this product. That came later.
I would say another example where there's kind of innovation and where there's been sort of design around putting people at the center has been in business models and in sort of organizational structure as well. I think it's a sort of well-known example from the Nordics, but if you think about Noma, for example, the restaurant, made quite a lot of news a few years ago when they said, we're changing the partnership structure of our restaurant. We are going to make some of the longtime dishwashers partners in this business. We're going to take people who've been back of the house, people who have been dealing more on the hospitality side, people who are not necessarily the sort of chef owner of the business, take part in the success of this, massive thing that's gone beyond just being a restaurant and has also, spawned nonprofits and spawned all kinds of educational initiatives to sort of change the business models in the industry.
Another way too that I think design is evolving, perhaps it started before the pandemic but was accelerated by the pandemic, is kind of helping people regulate their moods within the home and achieve the tasks or non-tasks. Like, we don't always have to be productive humans in the home space. So I think, designs of bedrooms or beds that can help you hide your device, because we know everyone goes to bed with them, especially young people. They literally cannot untether themselves from their phones. So having an organic part of your structure have a hiding place for your device, but you feel safe enough that you can still latch onto it. And then the integration of technology in many ways into home design and furniture, and all centered, like you were saying, around the human and helping us just relax and turn down as well when we need to.
So I think a lot of what we've heard is about the forethought of the designers themselves and how they're thinking about the end customer, which is very interesting. If we go on the other side, is there a difference with how Nordic customers approach purchasing things that also influences the designer? Or is it very similar to how US customers look at this? And maybe, Henrik, you could tell us about your experience if you notice if there's any differences there.
I mean, there are a lot of differences in buying behavior between Scandinavian consumer and the North American consumer, and I think some of it goes back to just values that we've kind of been brought up with. I think actually a really interesting example is what you mentioned just now with how dishwashers at Noma could get partnership. And it's back to your point about equality. We've sorted that out a long time ago in Scandinavia, right? Everybody's equal. It doesn't matter whether you're a plumber or a dishwasher or a lawyer or a doctor. You are still going to have a pretty nice life. And so when I look at consumers here, typically the consumer that will buy our product are quite wealthy. And almost to a degree where you think that people who are not wealthy don't have good taste, but they do. But they might simply be in a situation where they can't afford what we do. Whereas if you go to Scandinavia, regardless of whether you're a plumber, school teacher, or a lawyer or a doctor, there's a good chance you will have very nice furniture, because you first of all, you make a decent salary, but also you want to buy something that is nice and something that lasts. So to me, and I might not be completely wrong in this factually, but I think in this country, it's a mix with not making as much money, as there's really not much equality in that sense, and maybe not appreciating design and to buy long-lasting products. And typically, if a young person in Denmark buys a $10,000 lounge chair, they will keep that lounge chair from college till they pass it on to their son or daughter. There's no doubt. Whereas I think the typical, and I am generalizing a bit, the typical American consumer will buy a chair, and as soon as they're out of college, they'll throw it out and they'll buy something else in their first home, which is a small apartment in New York, and when they leave, they're going to throw it out, and then they're going to buy another one. I think there's a big difference there, but it's a mix of, do you have the money and do you buy to last, or do you just buy to consume?
I'll put a more positive spin on that, perhaps. And I will say that I think one thing's quite interesting about an American consumer, generally versus a Nordic one, is that For Americans, consuming and buying objects for yourself or for the home, it is a way of kind of experimenting with your identity. You're buying a chair to say, am I going to be this kind of person who has this chair? Oh, maybe not. Maybe I want to try this shirt on and try to be a little bit more punk, or maybe I'm going to try to express myself in this other way. I think in the US, I would say we have a bit more kind of dynamic experimentation about sort of who we are and who we want to be in the world. And I think material culture gives us it's sort of fodder for all of that and how that plays out. Yes, of course, there's an angle on that is about excessive and churn and all of that, but I think there is something interesting about all of the cultural experimentation and dynamism that sort of plays out in the kind of stuff that people have in their lives.
And we would love people to buy more chairs anyway, so it's okay if they want to switch around then.
Whereas you do see that sort of consistency in Denmark, right?
I completely agree.
Yeah.
When it comes to buying more chairs and younger people, one of the behaviors we're seeing with consumers that are Gen Z, so just kind of they may still be teenagers or approaching the working world, is that they may do a ton of research online, but they still want to go in and have a tangible experience with the product, so they may actually purchase or want like a really sophisticated retail experience where they have seen through the whole kind of and feel ownership of their purchase in the long term. But I think there's also a tension there with the way younger American or US-based consumers might buy when it comes to Nordic design, because they do like to switch things up and they like to have their own label and imprint on something, and if they see everyone else has the same thing, they're likely going to want to find a way to personalize it. So how do you marry long-term lasting, perhaps often expensive design with something that's super customizable and helps people also exude the value that Nordic design might have?
Just quick comment. I think you're right. I mean, I think US in that sense is much more dynamic, right? Scandinavia is quite homogeneous, if you will, right? It's very much the same to a degree where from the outside it might look boring, but it's probably other things they then are dynamic with. But I completely agree. It's two very different societies for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and Anna Sophia, you mentioned technology, and we can't talk about design without mentioning technology today. There's technology in everything, things that you would not ever have thought of have tech, smart this, smart that. But I think that we see multiple models of how technology can be integrated, and we see that some of the technologies introduced to get the customer's focus and attention, and so it becomes this sort of babysitting the product after a while. And we see other design that is much more built and design around the customer themselves. Can you tell us what you're seeing in terms of Nordic approach to integrating technology with products?
Sure. I think one space that when we think of design that used to be completely private was the bathroom. So when it comes to technology, there's now designs that help people track where they are throughout every space in the home, including the bathroom. But now people are becoming sort of data-driven with their behaviors. It might start out as just something that you're curious about, like how many steps a day did I take? Did I sleep well tonight? What is my, whatever I exude, like tell me about how my health when I'm in the restroom, or here's my smart mirror telling me where to go today. So there's an integration with the outside and inside worlds in spaces that used to kind of be more confined and separate to the human experience. So privacy plays into it, and also human curiosity. But then we're already seeing signs of people having kind of anxiety about all the data that is told about them as humans, and getting stressed out about not being healthy enough in different ways, just kind of sheerly based on smart home type of data that they might have.
I think one thing that I find super interesting about the way that technology is sort of working into the home, and maybe where it's going, is that there's been a lot more intersection between sort of sustainability discourse and technology discourse, which I think is quite interesting. I think people are sort of moving away from the idea that sustainability is just about consuming less or being, sacrificing or sort of taking things off of your plate. But it could, in many cases, be about sort of being more. If you have for example, a solar powered water heating system. If you have a kind of Tesla, those enable you to like sort of drive faster. They enable you to take sort of like longer, more luxurious showers. I think there's a way that sort of technology is enabling these kind of sensory experiences and these sort of sustainability that sort of provides a new sense of futurism and a sense of abundance, I think is quite interesting. And that's in many cases coming from the Nordics. There's a bit of the US influence in that as well, but I think moving away from that whole discursive sort of sacrifice and more kind of sustainability as technology-enabled pleasure, I think is quite interesting.
We were talking about customers in the U.S. When they look at, for example, a Danish design chair, especially for those who haven't been exposed to Nordic design, what should they be thinking about other than that's a very nice chair? What is a way that we can get people to start thinking about the values, the lifestyle, changing the way that they're thinking about things in a way that makes them, helps improve their lives, but also the lives of other people?
Again, I think we've given up a long time ago to kind of target everybody in US because it is a certain type of customer who is interested in what we do. And I think to them, yes, the look of the chair in this example is important, but it's also the history of the chair. Typically people who buy nicer things, and that's really whether it is a nice car or a nice watch or whatever it might be, are interested in the history of this, who designed it, how is it made, and so I think typically that's what they should look at, right? Are we really interested in the story of Arne Jacobsen designing this chair for the SAS Royal Hotel? Typically they will ask, how is it made, right? Well, there's about 1,100 hand-stitched stitches on the egg chair. That's really interesting to people. What kind of fabric or leather is it made in? And obviously the sustainability of the chair, which is not just the material it's made with or how it's produced, but also the longevity of the chair. So I think typically people who buy nice design, whether it is Danish or Italian or whatever it might be, they do look at like some of the romance in the product, the usability, but also the craftsmanship and the longevity. There's definitely some sustainability in just the fact that a product will last a lifetime or more.
I guess I would answer that by saying it's really important to understand with an American consumer, like, what is that product allowing this person to become? How is this sort of an affordance for them to be the kind of person that they want to be, to sort of realize some of their social ambitions and their kind of identity aspirations? It's not just about sort of, is it a nice chair, are the lines beautiful, is it quality materials, but sort of who will I be if I have this chair in my life? I think that's, it's a sort of classic American marketing mentality, but I do think it's something that sometimes when I see Nordic companies sort of struggle a little bit to understand and talk too much about the kind of object itself or the thing rather than the sort of story that the customer wants to tell about their life with this thing.
I think, and one of the things that we're seeing with younger generations too when it comes to the everlasting nature of these products is the trend of kind of going towards reloved or reused products is probably helping many who may have been outside of the sphere of being able to afford a Nordic design furniture at some stage be able to access it, and also have this fluidity with the designs and aesthetics that they have in the home. One interesting thing too is thinking of from a US audience, the minimalism that's associated with these designs is often spoken about as mid-century modern, and it's sort of a label, especially for millennial homeowners, to achieve a certain type of aesthetic. But now we're seeing the rising kind of group come up next and say, hey, that's not us at all. So they're into things like, very curated, we might call maximalist aesthetics that have a lot of things that tell them about their personality, some might call them knickknacks. There's grandma core that's really trendy, nostalgia aesthetics. So how will those types of new consumers start to relate to design that they might, in the US, associate with a cohort that they want to consciously separate themselves from?
And I think, especially in the creative space, when you have two cultures that meet, and New York is truly that meeting point for so many cultures around the world, something new and interesting happens, and that can be exciting. And that's what we see at Nordic Innovation House with the companies that come over here. We combine Nordic ingenuity and innovation with American commercialism, and we create something new and interesting and exciting. Looking forward over the next 5 to 6 years, what do you personally find exciting in the design space with Nordics, either in the US or in the Nordic region itself?
I don't think I have the best answer on this one, but I want to catch up on a couple of other points. I think what is actually interesting and for us as a Scandinavian premium furniture brand is kind of to your point that Americans a lot of time want something that is somewhat Scandinavian but not really. And so we see if we look at a home in Denmark, it almost looks like it could be our showroom, right? But when we then sometimes see the applications that our furniture is used in US, we're like, wow, this is awesome. It actually, this piece that you would otherwise see in a very minimalistic home somewhere actually fits really well into this. We have probably our most well-known lounge chair that you typically see in a very, very beautiful home in Scandinavia, or a Scottish country home, or a penthouse apartment in New York. Is in the San Francisco airport as one of hundreds of lounge chairs, right? And so that's what I find exciting and interesting about, you talked about Nordic design meeting United States, is this thing, as you say, where how does this fit with me? Who do I want to become? And we kind of get some learning from with this, where we're like, we really didn't see this coming, but it kind of makes sense now because they're pushing our boundaries as well. So that's what I enjoy about being a very solidly rooted Danish design company who wants to be international. We get all these learnings from these different markets we go into, where they kind of push us a bit and say, this is how we would like to use this product. And so as the world is getting more global, I think that will be some of the trends where certain designs will become more international, but kind of have their roots, but kind of figure out we can work different in different applications. And I think that's going to push designers as well to kind of wrap their heads around how do we do that? How do we make everybody happy about these things we do when it's all one big melting pot now?
Sure. On that note, I think we're living in a time where people are living alone more than ever, and there's also issues related to that from isolation and loneliness. But something we're seeing with Nordic design is kind of taking a small space that might previously have been thought of as unlivable and having now very tiny but super hyper-functional homes that have modularity in them, and you can switch up the living room into something else at a certain time of day if you want, and you might be out in nature because you can afford to be there. And so I think that's sort of an aspiration that's carrying over here too, and thinking about living in a different way, but also having access to community and others in these spaces that might help you celebrate being alone, but also having a connection to the outside world.
I think that connection to the outside world thing is really interesting. I mean, I think personally, everyone has remarked on the kind of return to nature, or the kind of craving for the outdoors that a lot of people have talked about during the pandemic, and a lot of people moving to the countryside or trying to take walks or trying to do all of that. I think that's been a place in the US, for example, where I think companies have really struggled. Like, the kind of outdoors hasn't really always been for everyone. It's been super far away, it's been expensive, it's been difficult to access, all that sort of stuff. I think we have a lot to learn from the sort of Nordic sensibility of keeping that all close and keeping that accessible. You can take the train to a beautiful forest, you can see all of that. I think there will be a sort of renewed attention on how do we actually get people a little bit better in touch with their natural environment. And also, I think there's something interesting from the Nordics where they see the sort of human civilization, you could say, and the outdoors as much more closely intertwined. In the U.S. often you have the sort of there's the cities, and then there's a kind of wilderness out there. And I think the way that those things are woven together and kind of combined in sort of beautiful everyday ways is, I think, something that people are going to be working on more and more kind of in design.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up So I want to thank Anna Sophia, Brendan, Henrik for joining us today. We really enjoyed hearing the conversation, some really interesting and engaging thoughts that you shared with us and our audience today. So thank you.